Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome on behalf of the 1816 Farmington Quaker Meetinghouse and our co-sponsor, Sonnenberg Gardens. I'm Kathy Hendricks with the Program Committee. Today marks the third and final of our 3 programs on our series, The Struggle for Women's Suffrage, Politics, and Race. Today, historian Judith Wellman is speaking to us on suffrage, race, and Quakers, principles versus pragmatism. To put it mildly, Judy is an expert on all 3 topics: the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention and suffrage in general, abolition in the Underground Railroad, and all things Quaker, especially in the 19th century. These have been areas of intense scholarship for her. And Judy is also a founding member, an active member of the 1816 Meetinghouse. This was intended to be a live public event at Sonnenberg in the mansion. We are still at Sonnenberg, not in the mansion. And of course, because of the pandemic, we decided it would be better to do this virtual. However, if you're watching it live stream, feel free to send in your questions. Just type them in, and Demian Spindler, our videographer, will make sure that we are part of the program. So again, we're all glad you're watching, and these things will be available on our website. All 3 programs are available on our website till the end of the year. Judy, tell us about it. Okay. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathy. As we all know, we're delighted to welcome you all here. And as we know, this gathering and this talk occurs in a very unusual historical moment. If there's one thing that the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and other people have done for us, it is to open up an unusual historical moment, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for us to look at the systemic racism that has infected our country from its beginning, look at it in the face, and decide what we can do about it, especially those of us who are white of European descent. This is not a new idea. You will recognize the all men, and I would say women, are created equal, that we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We have never managed to reach that goal in this country's history. We probably never will, but this is an opportunity to work toward that goal. So this talk is dedicated to the Declaration of Independence and to the ideals of creating a community in this country where we can respect all living things together. There are 3 women we're going to be looking at: Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony, and Alice Paul. And we are going to look at their commitment to equal rights. All of them indicated they were committed to universal rights for all people. We're going to look at their words and their actions, and then your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to decide whether their actions carried out that goal that they all espoused. We will have an opportunity built in, but I'll ask you to save your comments and questions and thoughts until the end, and we'll take a look at that question as we go through this talk. This is the year of the centennial of the 19th Amendment, as most of you know, and we do honor the tremendous achievement of suffragists who worked often for their whole lives so that women might have the right to vote. The largest number of people enfranchised in the history of our country came with the 19th Amendment, and it was promoted by people from a wide variety of ethnic, racial backgrounds, genders, cultures, geographic areas. We also recognize the racism inherent in the dominant culture suffrage movement. Some of you may have read Brent Staples' New York Times editorial And he's arguing that Stanton stripped of her halo. She was a classic liberal racist who embraced fairness in the abstract while publicly enunciating bigoted views of African American men. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that that is true. But Quakers are noted for their ideals of equality. Does Brent Staples' criticism of the suffrage movement apply to Quaker women suffragists? To answer these questions, we're going to look at these three women and at their own words. 3 generations, 3 choices, what happened and why, and this is just scratching the surface, but you'll get an idea of what they're thinking and doing. And what would you have done? These 3 women represent 3 different generations of nationally important Quaker reformers. They were important suffrage leaders, not within Quakerism necessarily, but within the larger culture. Lucretia Mott was born in Nantucket, Massachusetts, educated at Nine Partners boarding school, became a Quaker minister in Philadelphia. Her emphasis always was on the inner light, not on the Christ within rather than the Christ without. And she became an abolitionist, a peace advocate, advocate for women's rights, probably the best known woman minister in America. Susan B. Anthony, born in 1820, almost 30 years after Lucretia Mott, grew up in Adams, Massachusetts, and Battenkill, New York. She too was educated in Quaker schools, taught in Canongahary, became a lecturer in the 1850s for temperance, women's rights, and then abolitionism. And the youngest of the group, Alice Paul, born in 1885, which was 65 years after Susan B. Anthony, was born in Paulsdale, New Jersey, educated again at a Quaker school, then went to Swarthmore, studied in London, and then the University of Pennsylvania. While she was in London, she was powerfully influenced by radical British suffragists. And there she began her experience with jail terms and hunger strikes. When she came back to the United States in 1910, she decided that something had to be done to this rather staid suffrage movement as she saw it. As Quakers, these 3 women all endorsed universal rights. Many of them, we could say, probably would agree with George Fox with the admonition to walk cheerfully over the earth and answer that of God in every one. We can find quotes from all of them that support this idea. Lucretia Mott said, "My convictions led me to adhere to the sufficiency of light within us, resting on truth as authority rather than taking authority for truth." Susan B. Anthony, we demand, this is in 1869 when the vote was on her mind, for every man, black or white, and for every woman, black or white, that they shall be this instant enfranchised. And Anthony always felt that if she could do what she thought was right, she would leave the rest to God. Her work became her worship, she said. And Alice Paul, "I never doubted that equal rights was the right direction. Most reforms, most problems are complicated, but to me there's nothing complicated about ordinary equality." But in terms of their actions, while they all agreed on universal rights, these women lived in different times, and so they made different choices. Did they compromise their ultimate goals by the choices they made, or did they pragmatically decide to compromise in order to implement the larger principles? I don't expect you to come to a conclusion, but the question is worth asking. Lucretia Mott was rooted in abolitionism, and she represents the generation in which abolitionism and women's rights were really the same movements in many ways. She founded a biracial anti-slavery society in Philadelphia and a women's anti-slavery society in Philadelphia. She helped organize 3 national women's anti-slavery conventions in the late 1830s, and she thought these were the real beginning of women's organizing, not only for African Americans enslaved, but also for women. And she wrote to Elizabeth Cady Stanton in 1855, "From the time of the first convention of women, the battle began." this was a dramatic effort because you can see one of the halls where they met was burned because black and white women were there speaking in public. Maud also attended in 1840 the World's Anti-Slavery Convention in London, and there she met Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was newly married there on her honeymoon with abolitionist Henry Brewster Stanton. The big debate for the entire first day of the convention was, should we allow women delegates to be seated at this convention? They decided no. So all the women had to sit behind a bar, said Stanton, and you can see on the left side of the picture a kind of low bar with some women behind it. What happens when you put people together and don't allow them to mix with the larger group? They start talking to each other, and that's what they did. One of the things they decided was when they got home, they would hold a convention for women's rights. Every summer, Lucretia Mott would visit her sister, Martha Wright, in Auburn, which was just a little ways west of Seneca Falls. And she would go to Farmington, New York, and attend the Genesee Yearly Meeting of Friends in the 1816 Farmington Quaker Meetinghouse. And she would usually speak there as well. And there she met a group of Quakers who were absolutely committed to equal rights. And they worked for equal rights for African Americans, for women, for Seneca Indians, for poor people. They worked for peace. These are some of those people. They helped organize, for example, the Western New York Anti-Slavery Society, which was organized at the Farmington Meetinghouse in 1840. And they, throughout the 1840s, sponsored lecturers who would go throughout this region. And they sponsored, women sponsored anti-slavery fairs, which is where they got the money to carry on the lectures and carry on the movement. They were what we would today call, in Kimberly Crenshaw's words, they understood the idea of intersectionality, that because you're a woman doesn't mean you're not also affected by being a black woman or a white woman or a Native woman, and because you're Native doesn't mean you're not also affected by your gender or your class. And so they worked for all these reforms all at once, all the time. And an example is Lucretia Mott, when she came in 1848 in June, she visited Auburn Prison, she visited the Senecas at Cattaraugus, she visited several Native or African American people who had been freedom seekers and had gone to Canada. They also, a month later, after that visit of Mott to those three groups, helped organize the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York, July 19th and 20th, 1848, in this building, the Wesleyan Chapel. Both Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott were leaders at that convention. In fact, they held it so quickly because they wanted to hold it before Lucretia Mott had to go back to Philadelphia because she was their best known speaker, so they thought she would attract people, which she did. But there were two issues on which they disagreed. I bet you can't guess. One question was, should they support voting rights for women? Elizabeth Cady Stanton was absolutely sure they should. And Frederick Douglass, who had been working for voting rights equal to white men for African American men for years, realized the power of the vote, and he supported Elizabeth Cady Stanton in that demand. Lucretia Mott reputedly said, and no one has seen this in her own handwriting, but reputedly she said, "Lizzie, thee will make us ridiculous." Why would she think that voting would be such a request or demand that would make them ridiculous? I think it's because she was a Quaker, and for many Quakers, they did not participate in a political system that they saw as based on violence and power. None of them voted, not men or women. And in spite of that disagreement, the convention, the resolution number 9 that demanded the right to vote did pass by a small majority. The other question they disagreed on, and you can just see this sort of by reading between the lines, should the women's movement be based only on women's rights alone, or should it deal with larger issues? Now, Stanton wanted to call the Seneca Falls Convention to deal solely with the rights and conditions of women. But when Lucretia Mott actually spoke, you can see her words in the minutes of the convention. And you notice that on Wednesday evening, she spoke with her usual eloquence and power on the subject of reforms in general. And on Thursday, the last resolution of the entire conference was Lucretia Mott's resolve that the speedy success of our cause depends upon the zealous and untiring efforts of both men and women for the overthrow of the monopoly of the pulpit and for the securing to women an equal participation with men in the various trades, professions, and commerce. She had the last word, and it wasn't that this should be only a women's movement. She wanted to make a movement for equality for everyone together. So one of the questions that you might want to think about is, what would you have done? What do you think? Would you have advocated separate meetings for women and men? Would you have advocated that every meeting be a reform meeting that tackled all reforms together? One of the things that emerged from the Seneca Falls Convention that historians have not fully appreciated is a biracial coalition that was grounded in this idea of intersectionality, of equal rights for everyone, right now, all the time. And it was called the Congregational Friends. They organized in the Farmington Meetinghouse October 7th, 1848, later became known as the Friends of Human Progress or the Progressive Friends. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was the speaker, the keynote speaker at that organizational meeting, and one of the young men in the audience kept a diary, and she said she passed around a resolution for suffrage, which I signed. That Congregational Friends was one of 3 or 4 meetings across the Northeast that broke into this group away from traditional Quaker meetings to meet with men and women together, the very first time that women and men met together instead of in separate meetings among Quakers or for business meetings. And Lucretia Mott was elated. What a wonderful breaking up there is among sects, she said. That's exactly what she thought. She always kept her own membership in the traditional Cherry Street meeting in Philadelphia, but she was really glad to see these other reform-oriented meetings. The Congregational Friends advocated a balance, as Mott said, between the light within and righteousness without. Their organizational document said, we want to abandon creeds and talk about practical righteousness. That's how we judge ourselves and other people. By 1852, Stanton wrote to her friend Martha Wright, I am a member of the Congregational Friends. She said, I've heard a report that I joined the Episcopal Church in Seneca Falls. And she said, I would be, if my women's rights scruples allowed me to do that, my religious ones certainly wouldn't. I feel as if I've been accused of petty larceny. I consider myself a member of the Congregational Friends. And they became a nest of reformers, some of them Quakers, some of them like Frederick Douglass, Charles Lennox, Ramon, Sojourner Truth, who were not Quakers. In 1854, they published a call to their annual meeting, which they held in Waterloo, juniest meeting of Friends every year. And they said the platform is broad and comprehensive, admitting the most perfect liberty of conscience, an assembly in which Christians, Jews, Mohammedans, and pagans, by whom they meant traditional native people, men and women of all names and no name may labor together for the promotion of human welfare with no other law but the law of love. The reason this is nationally important and ought to be, I think, incorporated more dramatically into national histories is that they became a prototype for an organization that was formed in 1866, right after the Civil War, called the American Equal Rights Association. Their goal was to secure equal rights to all American citizens, especially the right of suffrage, irrespective of race, color, or sex. And the people who showed up and organized the American Equal Rights Association were like a group of people who had been going to these Congregational Friends meetings that started here in Farmington and Central New York in 1848. And they were black and white, they were men and women, they were Quakers and non-Quakers. They articulated an absolute commitment to total equality, universal rights for all people, but they split apart over strategies. Would they work for suffrage for everyone right now, immediately, or would they work separately for voting rights for women and African Americans in particular? And that issue came to a head at the third annual meeting of the American Equal Rights Association in 1869. The two people who were most articulate and vociferous with those two distinct value systems were Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass. They both came out of the Congregational Friends. They both endorsed universal suffrage. Douglass, for the end of his life, endorsed universal suffrage. But they very publicly disagreed about how they should accomplish that. Douglass was supporting wholeheartedly the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which would give voting rights to African American men, but not to black women or white women or any woman. And he said, I must say that I don't see how anyone can pretend that there's the same urgency in giving the ballot to women as to the Negro. With us, it's a question of life and death. And he was talking in the context of race riots in the South that were killing and burning and murdering hundreds of people of color. And he went on to say, this is a famous quote, so I'll share it here. When women, because they are women, are hunted down through the cities of New York and New Orleans, when they're dragged from their houses and hung upon lampposts, when their children are torn from their arms and their brains dashed out upon the pavement, which was happening, he was describing this in real time, when they're objects of insult and outrage at every turn, when they're in danger of having their homes burnt down over their heads, when their children are not allowed to enter schools, then they will have an urgency to obtain the ballot equal to our own. There was a shout from the audience, and you might guess what it was. What about black women? And Susan B. Anthony was oblivious seemingly to the situation on the ground. And she came out directly looking Douglass in the face and said, if intelligence, justice, and morality are to be placed in the government, then let the question of women be brought up first and that of the Negro last. And everyone says, yeah, well, when Mr. Douglass mentioned the black man first and the women last, if he'd noticed, he would have seen it was the men that clapped and not the women. So Douglass supported the 15th Amendment both on principle and strategically. He thought, we can get the 15th Amendment through. There's no way we could get it through if it also included women of whatever color. And it will protect black people against white violence, and it's one step toward suffrage for everybody, including women. Susan B. Anthony said, absolutely no way. The principle is universal suffrage. We're going to support universal suffrage, and we're not going to make any compromises. And we don't want to support something that gives the vote to male citizens and not to women. Lucy Stone came out in an interesting way, and so did Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who was one of the black women present. Stone is trying to be a peacemaker. She says, woman has an ocean of wrong, too deep for any plummet, and the Negro too has an ocean of wrongs that cannot be fathomed. But I thank God for the 15th Amendment. I will be thankful in my soul if anybody can get out of this terrible pit. Let them do it. So the question for you is, do you think? Was there a right strategy there or not? Did Anthony compromise? Did Douglass, Stone, and Harper compromise? Did their compromises undermine the goal of universal suffrage? Did Susan B. Anthony's stance and commitment to suffrage for women as well as African Americans undermine that goal? After that 1869 meeting, two groups emerged. One was around Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They called themselves the National Woman Suffrage Association because they advocated a federal amendment for suffrage, not a state-by-state effort. which is what the Constitution allows. Guess who was president? Lucretia Mott became president, not of an organization for the right of suffrage for everybody, but only a right of suffrage for women, which she'd not advocated in 1848 at Seneca Falls. The second group was the American Woman Suffrage Association, and they had a state-by-state approach. Included people like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper or Lucy Stone. They had men as well as women officers, and Henry Ward Beecher, the best-known minister in the country, became the president. Those two groups finally joined in 1890 into the National American Woman Suffrage Association. The National American Woman Suffrage Association, sometimes called NASA, was formed in the middle of the rise of Jim Crow discrimination. This is the period at the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction when white Southerners organized to undermine in every way possible the right of African Americans to access in any way to schools, to public transportation, particularly to the vote. They were willing to do it in every way possible, including lynchings. There were more than 4,000 lynchings between 1880 and 1940 in this country, and almost all of them were men of color. 1890, Mississippi decides we can begin to limit voting for African American men without contradicting the 15th Amendment if we say, well, you have to have lived here for so long, you have to be able to memorize the Constitution, you have to be able to read, your grandfather has to have voted, you have to pay a poll tax. So in every way they could think of that wasn't an attack on the 15th Amendment, they limited the right of African American men to vote. And in 1896, the Supreme Court came out with Plessy v. Ferguson, which really was not overturned until 1954, and Brown v. Board of Education. Some people have called this the nadir of race relations in the U.S., but other people have noted that it was the woman's hour. You get a newspaper called the Women's Era. What do you do if you're an African American woman being told that it's the woman's hour, but you're a black woman being told it's the nadir of race relations? You have to work on all those issues together, and they did. They formed a group called the National Association of Colored Women in 1896. This posed an issue for the National American Woman Suffrage Association, which is mostly white women. Should we support the right of black women to vote when we know that we cannot get the southern states to support the right of women to vote if it's also going to include black women? What are they going to do? Particularly, we'll personify it with Susan B. Anthony. What the heck does Susan B. Anthony do? Well, she kind of makes a compromise. She said, all right, on the one hand, I'm a member of NASA. I have to go with the flow. I have to do what has to be done to get women's suffrage through. On the other hand, I'm a person who values interracial cooperation and respect for all people. And so when she was acting in her official capacity, she was basically silent or complicit. When she's acting as a person, she acts in quite a different way. And this has given me a new appreciation for the stresses that Susan B. Anthony must have faced in this period. So here we are at 1895. This is the first national convention that NASA will have in the South. It's in Atlanta, Georgia. And Susan B. Anthony writes to Douglas and says, do not come to this convention. If you come to this convention, it'll be all about black rights, not about women's rights, and we'll never make any progress. He doesn't come. At the same time, and this is like 2 weeks later, Douglas appears at the National Council of Women's meeting in Washington, D.C., which has been more open than the NASA to black women and white women meeting together. Anthony welcomes him to the stage. He doesn't speak, but he sits there all afternoon with these women. Then he goes home to Cedar Hill, which is near downtown Washington, and dies right there in the foyer of his home in the arms of his wife, Helen Pitts. Anthony was totally devastated. At the request of Douglas's family, she does speak at his funeral. The following year, she welcomes Harriet Tubman to a meeting in Rochester of the New York State Women's Suffrage Association. In 1903, this is a key period, the National Association held its annual meeting in New Orleans. This is Louisiana, the Deep South. African American women were not welcomed at this meeting, but Susan B. Anthony goes. They stay at the St. Charles Hotel, and Anthony had just written a letter supporting the right of black men to vote to a newspaper that was published. A New Orleans newspaper picks up her statement, and the whole National Association realizes if we're going to be tarred with the feathers of pro-black voting rights, we'll never get anywhere in New Orleans. So the executive committee meets, and this is what they say. The association has no view on this subject. Like every other national association, it's made up of persons of all shades of opinion on the race question. It's kind of interesting shades of opinion on the race question, but the National American Women's Suffrage Association is seeking to do away with the requirement of a sex qualification for suffrage. What other qualifications shall be asked for? It leaves to each state. In other words, Mississippi, Louisiana, South Carolina can make whatever restrictions they wish on black women and white women and black men voting, including grandfather clauses and poll taxes, etc. We're not going to take a stand for the right of black women to vote if you can figure out a way to keep them from voting. In other words, this is a white women's movement. Carrie Chapman Catt, a reporter, asked her, well, what about these black women in the suffrage movement? He probably said colored women. I'm told we have them, she said, but I do not know them personally. I have no communication with them as Negroes. So but there's Susan B. Anthony. She's the honorary president of NASA. She's in New Orleans. She's 83, and she's tired, so she doesn't do a lot in public. Maybe that's why she didn't say anything. But instead, what she does is really interesting. She challenges Catt's statement and the whole NASA Executive Committee resolution. She goes to speak to the Phyllis Wheatley Club in New Orleans, which is the main black women's club in New Orleans, and it's very public. And Sylvanie Williams, who's the president, makes a very public, much publicized and printed address. When women like you, Miss Anthony, come to see us and speak to us, it helps us believe in the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man, and at least for the time being, in the sympathy of woman. And then on the way home, she stops at Tuskegee. She talks to Margaret Washington, who's Booker T. Washington's wife and a suffragist. She talks to students about women's rights and women's suffrage. When she gets to Rochester, she gets on the stage of Central Church to support a meeting called to support and defend the rights of black men to vote. And she adroitly uses her speech to tell, I'll let you listen to it. The men of the North can't reasonably advocate the enfranchisement of the Negro while they withhold the same advantage from the women of their own part of the country. They're really in such a muddle that they don't know how to get out of it. And then she'd written a letter earlier to this group. She said, I'm writing to because I want to support people who are like sufferers with my sex, that is African American men and women of all colors. And the act, she said, of splitting over the 14th and 15th Amendments opened the way for where we are now with injustice to men of all races and other people than women. At that meeting, Hester Jeffrey, who lived in Rochester at the time, was an African-American activist, helped raise money for the Frederick Douglass statue, the first statue erected publicly to a man of color in this country. She was in the audience. Jeffrey was a member of the AME Zion Church, the Unitarian Society, which Anthony also attended. She was an organizer for the National Association of Colored Women. She spoke in support of a suffrage resolution in 1904 in which the National Association of Colored Women came out directly and strongly for women's suffrage. She organized a club in Rochester, which she called the Susan B. Anthony Club.
And she worked, obviously, with Susan B. Anthony closely together in Rochester. Anthony's very last public act, a month before she died, was to give a speech at the AME Zion Church in Rochester, hosted by Hester Jeffrey. Hester Jeffrey gave a eulogy at Anthony's funeral. And here's the church, which is still standing. We'd like to get it on the National Votes for Women Trail because it's a wonderful, wonderful building. In 1906, the very first public monument to Susan B. Anthony was in the Memorial AME Zion Church with money raised by Hester Jeffrey. So what do you think? Did Anthony compromise her universal rights idea by not confronting the racism within NASA? Or did she use her compromises to try to make a larger goal more accessible? And then there is the third woman, Alice Paul. How did she handle these issues? She was a Quaker, and she said, as far as I know, I'm actuated by no race prejudice. I'm not prejudiced. I'm Northern. I've never lived in the South. I belong to a Quaker family, which has always supported black rights, and all of the traditions of my family and home make me disposed to side with and not against the Negro. So what does she actually do? Washington, D.C. parade, you might have heard of this because it's been in the news a lot lately, 1913. Nellie Quander, who was president of Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority at Howard University, wrote her a note and said, we'd like to march as sorority women in the 1913 suffrage parade, but we don't want to do it if we meet discrimination on account of race. Can you tell us where we can march with the college women? So what does Alice Paul say? She said, it would be unfortunate if we had any large number of Negroes in our suffrage procession. The feeling against them is so bitter. As far as I can see, we must have a white procession or a Negro procession or no procession at all. It's too bad, but no. Anna Howard Shaw, who was president of NASA at the time, heard about this and sent Alice Paul a telegram. She says, we're informed that the parade committee has so strongly declared colored women not to march that it amounts to official discrimination, which is distinctly contrary to instructions from the national headquarters. So there's another issue that divides the Alice Paul's group from the national group. What was the results? Well, there were 5,000 women in this parade. They were attacked. Police gave no protection. They probably got more publicity being attacked than they would have if they just plain old marched. And where were the African American marchers? This is from the crisis in 1913. And notes, an order went out to segregate them in the parade, but there was so much protest that finally the women marched by state. They were marching by sorority. The Delta Sigma Theta sorority, which broke off from Alpha Kappa Alpha, marched with Mary Church Terrell and one male chaperone, because they wouldn't let the girls march without a chaperone. Ida B. Wells marched with Illinois. Other African American women marched if they were teachers or librarians or musicians or artists. They marched with their group. But Alice Paul never changed her mind. She was totally committed to the idea that her goal was only women's rights, and that if you were a black woman, being black took precedence over being a woman. And here's one last example. You may be familiar with this statue. It was put up, unveiled, February 15th, 1921, and look at, these are our heroes. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Lucretia Mott, all white, all early women's rights advocates. Mary White Ovington, who was a white member of the board of the NAACP, wrote a letter to Alice Paul, who was then head of the National Women's Party, and she said, I think you should invite a black woman to represent black women at the unveiling of this statue. And I'd like to suggest Mary Talbert, who's the best known colored woman in America, to represent black women. And what did Alice Paul say? Well, Mary White Ovington realized Alice Paul's focus at that point is on women's rights, and she said, Mary Talbert actually can represent women's right to vote and women's suffrage and women's rights. And she referenced a riot in Ocoee, Florida, which was a massacre and a lynching over the right of black people in Ocoee to vote. There was one the woman of the man, the daughter of the man who was actually lynched, met the lynch mob at the door of her house and shot into the mob. And there were other places all over the South where black women were being subjected to the same kinds of restrictions that black men had been restricted from voting. Lucy Burns, who was Alice Paul's administrator and sidekick in the National Women's Party, sent Mary White Ovington's letter to Lucy Burns, and she said, I think this suggestion's been already included in your plans, but I think we should give it a favorable recommendation. And what did Alice Paul do? She refused to invite Mary Talbert. She said, Talbert doesn't represent a feminist organization. Mrs. Talbert would not be able, or Mary White Ovington says to Paul, to speak at your session because she doesn't represent a feminist organization. Like, because she's a black woman, she isn't a feminist and she can't be part of the women's movement. And then Ovington also wrote, may I point out that Mrs. Talbert does represent the colored women of the United States, and that no white woman today can represent the colored women of this country. Owing to our caste system, these women are little known by white women and carry on their organization largely distinct from the organizations of your or my race. D, I think when your statue of Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton is unveiled, it's realized that no colored woman has been given any part in your great session. The omission will be keenly felt by thousands of people throughout the country. Alice Paul continues in that vein, but it does seem to me that she's very clear that if you're a black woman, you're not really a feminist woman, and I don't want you part of my movement. Did she compromise her principles by refusing to invite Mary Talbert? Did she compromise her ideals of voting? Well, they'd already got voting rights, women's rights, and she was about to suggest the Equal Rights Amendment at Seneca Falls in 1923. Or was her effort by advancing white women's rights to create a base from which the rights of all women? What can we learn from Maud Anthony Paul about Quakers, about universal values, about actions as opposed to ideals, about making compromises that might be pragmatic efforts toward the final goal, or maybe they erode the final goal? I think these questions aren't answerable in an easy way, in an immediate way, but they're questions that we all face and that we all perhaps need to take more seriously in our own current historical moment. And I was impressed with Martin Luther King's 1967 statement. We're now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We're confronted with the fierce urgency of now. So what we do, what you and I do with these questions and these issues of race and women's rights is going to make a difference for our children and our grandchildren. And thank you for being here to think about this.
Thank you, Judy. Judy, do we have any questions? Demian?
Not at the moment. Let me ask.
Can you answer one for me?
Sure.
When it comes to the 19th Amendment and whether it was going to be for white women or for all women or women of color, what I don't understand is with the 14th Amendment, the one that color is not an issue for voting, why would that not then include, when you say women, the sex won't be an issue? Why wouldn't it be for all women?
That's a good question. And the 14th Amendment has a clause that says all people are citizens who are born or naturalized in the United States. So actually, Stanton and Anthony said, well, if we're all citizens, we should all vote, right? And they tried to take that, they called it the New Departure. And that's one reason that Anthony and dozens of other people across the country, 15 more women in Rochester voted with Anthony, dozens everywhere else, including Sojourner Truth in Battle Creek, Michigan. That's why they went to the polls and demanded to vote in 1872 in November, because they said, we're citizens, citizens' right to vote, we're going to vote. What made Anthony's case somewhat different than most people's was the registrars, who were kind of young and inexperienced, I think were intimidated by Susan B. Anthony, and they said, oh, okay, here, sign here. And so they did register, and she did vote. And that's why she was arrested, brought to Canandaigua, right down the road, to the courthouse in June 1873, and tried for voting. And that decision against her, and then the Supreme Court 3 years later in Minor v. Happersett said, the Constitution says that defining voting rights is a state issue, not a federal one, and citizenship is not the same as being a voter, because if your state says that you have to pay a poll tax, or you have to be this color, or you have to be whatever, that we have to go with the state decision. So after that, a lot of the emphasis shifted back to a state-by-state approach, until the early 20th century, when they decided this is ridiculous, it's not going to work, we better start working with a federal amendment again. They called it the Susan B. Anthony Amendment because that had been her argument.
Okay, we have a question. Was the general citizenship in the Farmington area supportive of the Quaker views on equal rights in the 1840s and 50s, through the 50s?
Can you repeat the question?
What was did the
great.
general citizenship in the Farmington area support Quaker views on on equality? Mostly yes, because most of them were Quakers in the Farmington area. So, but Quakers have a long history of splitting apart, and there were quietist Quakers who did not want to talk, did not want to have their quiet meetings interrupted with any of these reform demands, and that's one reason there was the split in 1848. The reformers just walked out, like 200 of them walked out of Genesee early meeting, and left the rest of them to be quiet in their meetings for worship. So there were different kinds of Quakers as well.
Now let's see if any other questions come in.
Yes, Lyle.
In speaking with a community elder this morning and describing my anticipation of this program, she quoted her grandmother, who was married to a Universalist minister, who said, sometimes to move forward, angels need to dance with the devil.
Mm-hmm.
The important thing is to recognize when the music stops. And that's been a framework for me in listening to this presentation today.
So compromise is sometimes necessary, but you have to know when to call a halt to it and how much. Yes, I think one of the questions you ask is, like Douglas, we can get through voting rights for black men now, maybe never again. We can't possibly get that through if we add women. So what's realistic and black men and women and children are being killed, hanged and murdered. But he went on the very next year, he's got a lengthy speech on women's suffrage that's published. He speaks for women's suffrage the rest of his life, and his last public act is to go to a women's rights convention. He never gives up promoting that second stage. What Anthony seems to be doing is she's committed to women's rights, but she's willing to compromise in the 1890s by not trying to change the trajectory of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Maybe thinking again that if we try to do it universally for everybody, no one will get it right now. So let's do it step by step. The question is, after 1920, people often who don't read the amendment necessarily think it gave voting rights to all women. If you were a Chinese American, you were subject to the Chinese Exclusion Act. You couldn't even be a citizen. You couldn't, and I think it was the McCarran-Walter Act of 1952 that finally allowed Asian people to become U.S. citizens. If you're in Puerto Rico, you don't, and you're a woman, you don't get to vote till the 1930s. If you're a Native person, you don't get to vote in many states if you're living in on a reservation. And some Native people, the Indian Citizenship Act in 1954 allowed Indian people who were off the reservation to become citizens. A lot of people, like a lot of Haudenosaunee, said, I don't want to be a citizen. I'm a Seneca, I'm an Onondaga. Why would I want to be a citizen of the United States of America? So it becomes, the more you look at it, it's a much more complicated issue. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 and a couple of amendments later allowing provisions for non-English speaking people and also people with various disabilities to vote was a huge step forward to making citizenship equal, coterminous with voting. But it's been gutted by the Selby v. Howard 2013 Supreme Court decision that has no federal review whatsoever now of any state voting laws. And you can see it in gerrymandering and other efforts to close voting places and to create difficulties for people, mostly people of color or people in poor neighborhoods, to vote. And so it's still going on. I think one reason this issue is so powerful to us today is that we still confront it and it's not resolved. In a democracy like the United States of America, we still do not have equal voting rights for every citizen.
Right. Our next question is, were there Underground Railroad activities in Farmington, and was it supported by the Quakers?
Oh, yes, there were.
Repeat it again.
Oh, the question was, were there Underground Railroad activities in Farmington, and was it supported by the Quakers? Yes. One of my favorite stories, it starts here, the knowledge we have of it in Canandaigua. There was a black man, he'd been enslaved, his name was Richard Valentine, he lived in Canandaigua. And he was quite an outspoken speaker and local citizen. His wife was a Seneca Indian. She's apparently working as a cook for a local white family, one of the sisters of Francis Seward and William Henry Seward. And their daughter writes, much later in her life, a memoir recounting the various Underground Railroad stories that she had known as a child. And she said, we heard a knock on our kitchen door one night, and Richard Valentine comes in, and he's got a black woman and 2 children. And he said, they need to get out of here. They need to get to Canada right away. So she said, well, the cook started making food, and my mother started putting us kids to making clothes and things they could take, and we gathered all the extra things we could, and we packed it all up, and we sent them directly to Farmington. And from there they went on to Canada. Often they would go either to Rochester from Farmington or to Pulteneyville and be taken on a steamboat to Canada. So there are several examples of that.
Our next question is, how did the Quakers respond to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850?
Repeat it again.
Sorry, yeah. How did the Quakers respond to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850? I don't know enough about any formal responses, but Quaker abolitionists, like other abolitionists that I know, were appalled and horrified. And one of the things that seems to happen is, at least in upstate New York abolition, well, New England as well, and Hudson Reserve in Ohio, is that people begin to be more willing to think about violence in opposition to slavery. That had been something that a lot of African Americans were willing to do from very early. If you got to capture somebody physically, you do it. A lot of white abolitionists around here, at least, were more, modest, I guess. It said, no, this is a moral movement. We're not going to get involved in any physical resistance to slavery. After 1850, and actually in Casanova on August 22nd, 1850, they hold a fugitive slave convention. And a lot of people who had escaped from slavery and settled in New York State went to that convention, about 50 of them, and they supported a statement by this group about what to do to attack slavery. And it was very clear, you do whatever you have to do. I think a lot of Quakers were really challenged, like, should I or shouldn't I? Slavery is so bad. And I think, like many of us now, what is the right thing to do? I can't give you a definitive answer that every Quaker felt one way or another.
Okay. Was Lucy Stone's compromise that she thought if black men were allowed to vote first, it would open the way for universal suffrage?
Oh, yes. Yes, she did. And that's why she became so active in the American Woman Suffrage meeting. Was Lucy Stone's compromise in 1869, did she continue to work for suffrage? Yes, she did. She and her husband, Henry Blackwell, and then her daughter, Alice Stone Blackwell, were very active in the American Woman Suffrage Association the rest of their lives. Yes. Thank you all.
Is that it?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Judy.